All right, so we are live here, I hope. See if I can take down that other stream that didn't work. I'll just leave it up for now. Hopefully people will be able to find the right stream that's actually working. What's up, everybody? I'm just going to try to make sure I got everything good on my end. Had some technical difficulties. All right, so we are live here. All right, sounds good. Sorry about that, y'all. We're supposed to start about almost 10 minutes ago now, but this damn OBS software, man. It's so convoluted. Feel free to chime in the chat. Let me know who you are, who's watching. We will get started. Tonight we're going to be talking about Story of the Negro by Booker T. Washington, as well as Harriot Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl. It is Black History Month. And I didn't necessarily plan it like that, but when I decided to do the stream, I realized, hey, it's Black History Month, so that's pretty cool. So I think we will start with Booker T. Washington. This is a really fascinating, all-encompassing sort of social, historical narrative of not only slavery, but also black and white relations, which is really interesting. And basically what Booker T. Washington does in Story of the Negro is basically takes you from the early cultures of, during the transatlantic slave trade all the way to, the early 1920s, basically. So it's a really good place to start just for American history, slave history. And the reason that we're juxtaposing the Booker T. Washington with the Harriet Jacobs is because they're almost completely different narratives. Yes, they do kind of sort of bleed into each other at times. But throughout this lecture, you'll kind of see that, there's many different ways to kind of interpret slavery. And with Booker T. Washington's, we have sort of this almost, I don't want to say sympathetic sort of perspective of slavery, but more of, like I said, an all-encompassing sort of retrospective of slavery and not focusing so much on the negative aspects of slavery, but talking about sort of how the African Americans were able to overcome the shackles of slavery and how they sort of worked with the white societies to further progress their agendas as a race, and how they were able to do that. So it's going to be really interesting. What's up, Dreamo? How you doing? Hopefully you got my last email. Glad you could join us tonight. Just a Red Bull in case anybody's curious. Got to get that GMO drink on. So let's kind of start from the beginning of Story of the Negro. We'll try to keep this lecture maybe to about an hour because I know it's Sunday night and you guys have got other stuff to do. But so obviously this book starts with an introduction sort of spanning the time periods of Reconstruction, black origins, not only in America, but also in Africa, and also the black economics, the system of African-American economics, which I think is really interesting. Basically, the first part basically states, Booker T. Washington used his own life experience as the template for writing history of the race in his 1909 The Story of the Negro. Equal parts sociology, history, cultural critique, and memoir, Story of the Negro is written in the spare and accessible style that became Washington's trademark. Just a little brief background on Booker T. himself. A former slave, Booker T. Washington kept an eye toward the need of former slaves had for a creation narrative to help facilitate their emergence as a free people, and he saw the story of the Negro as that narrative. Washington presented his history in three sections. Number one, the Negro in Africa. Number two, the Negro as a slave. And number three, the Negro as a free man. And basically this book spans all those different time periods and talks about some very relevant historical figures and how during the time of Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, early 1900s, and how the blacks were able to overcome their the adversary and the problems. And it's not focusing so much on the cruelty of slavery, or which he does touch upon that. But he says here, the need for survival of the trauma of the Middle Passage of the transatlantic slave trade and the crucible of American slavery, all of which he thought provided the basis for their contribution to the creation of a distinctive American culture. So Booker T is also not only concerned with how blacks were able to overcome all this stuff, right, but he's also concerned with the ways that black Americans enriched not only the white societies, but just the American societies at large, and how the white societies collaborated with, the ex-slaves, and how they almost worked together in a way to, in some cases, obviously they didn't always work together, especially in, the Deep South and stuff like that, but we do have this almost collaborative effort to help further the interests of ex-slaves, not only economically and socially, but also in sort of a spiritual sort of awakening. He talks about the early black churches and the reverends and stuff that sort of were very instrumental in sort of orchestrating the progression of ex-slaves. So we'll probably skip the introduction here. Let me see if there's anything that stands out to me here. Gives a little history of different black groups, such as the NAACP. So we have here in the first chapter, he's sort of documenting the transatlantic slave trade. He says, to most of the slaves, the Middle Passage, as the journey from the shore of Africa to the shores of America was merely a tradition of a confused and bewildering experience concerning whose horrors they had never heard any definite details. Nothing but the vaguest notions remain at the time I was a boy, even among the older people in regard to the mother country of my race. So he's almost sort of promoting this idea that the transatlantic slave trade and all the hardship that took place was sort of, by this time in the 1800s, was sort of this far away, distant, sort of legendary sort of philosophy that existed with African Americans, which I think is really interesting. He says here, it has often occurred to me that people who talk of removing the Negro from the southern states and colonizing him in some distant part of the world do not reflect how deeply he is rooted in the soil, meaning how deeply the black Americans are rooted in the soil. Somebody texted me. All right, just making sure it wasn't a text about the broadcast. In most that the white man has done in this continent, from the time Columbus landed on San Salvador until Perry penetrated the farthest north, the Negro has been his constant companion and helper. In a lot of ways, that's true, right? And that's another part of Booker T. Washington's narrative, is the way that the blacks, not only elevated themselves despite the odds, but they also helped to elevate and enrich the white societies, whether it's economically or socially. So he's sort of, what I like about this narrative in particular is that he's not starting with this sort of woe is me, white people are bad, black people suffered. And yes, he does talk about that, but he's sort of talking about the collaborative effort that existed between the two cultures. Now, Booker T. Washington is, of course, more of a light-skinned black, and some people accuse him of being an Uncle Tom. Some people accused him of, sort of trampling on his ancestors. He was not necessarily, he was more of a sort of a sociological, cultural scholar versus a real strong black activist. So that could be one way to kind of interpret his book, but he's also an activist, and he's also a philosopher and sort of a sociologist. So that's one way to sort of understand what he's doing here. It seems to me now, as I recall my first definite impressions of my race in Africa, that the books I read when I was a boy always put the pictures of Africa and African life in an unnecessarily cruel contrast with the pictures of the civilized and highly cultured Europeans and Americans. So he's sort of talking about the perceptions that he had as a boy regarding his own race. He says, I made up my mind also that in the end, the world must come to respect the Negro for just those virtues for which some people say he is despised, namely because of his patience, his kindliness, and his lack of resentment towards those who do him wrong and injustice. And of course, that's an interesting statement because he gets into this sort of concept later, but he talks about how the overall personality or the overall perseverance and sort of the collaborative attitude of a lot of the black Americans sort of help them in their dire circumstances in order to not necessarily always revolt or try to get revenge, but they were willing to sort of look their opponents, look their ex-masters or their white masters in the eye and sort of say, what can I do for you? Sort of under the guise that they were also going to get something out of it in return. So there's a very sort of collaborative and sort of diplomatic nature to the Negro race, according to Booker T. Washington, what I think is really cool. So there's a really interesting passage coming up here. We're skipping around a little bit. And this is a very, very dense text. As you can see, we're not going to be able to cover every single thing in here, but I hope you guys will get something out of it. So let's skip ahead here. So he does talk about sort of the social hierarchy of the mixed the lighter skinned blacks versus the darker skinned blacks, and sort of the disadvantages or the advantages rather that take place within that sort of socio-racial hierarchy. He says here, one man will argue very seriously that there should be no mixture of blood for the reason that he is quite sure that wherever there is a mixture, it results in a weakened individual, bodily, mentally, and morally. With 10 or 15 minutes, another man will begin in the absence of the first to discuss the same subject and will, in an equally serious and positive manner, state that whenever in all history the Negro has been able to accomplish anything of value to the world, it had been because he had some tincture of the white blood in his veins. So he's sort of critiquing that narrative that, the lighter skinned you are, the better or the more successful. But unfortunately, by default, especially during this time, and even still sometimes today into modern times, the lighter skin you are, the more successful you can become. Not always, but it's definitely a thing. It's known as colorism. Let me know if you guys have experienced anything like that or are aware of that. So he talks a little bit about that here. And he says here, with the possible exception of the Jew, no race has ever been subjected to criticism so searching and candid, to state it mildly, as the Negro. And yet I have found that those who have known and understood the Negro best have usually been kindest in their judgment of him and most hopeful of his future. And he goes on to talk about he was talking about sort of how not only are the, especially during post-Reconstruction, early 1900s, late 1800s, not only were blacks, fighting to sort of establish themselves, but they're also trying to sort of take account or sort of create their own creation story, like he talked about in the beginning, but they're also sort of looking to the future with how they want to insert themselves in economics and politics and how they went about doing that. He says here, a Southern white man may tell you with the utmost positiveness that he never knew a single Negro who would not steal except one. Every white man knows one Negro who is all right, a model of honesty, industry, and thrift, and if he tries to remember, he will think of other Negroes in whom he has the greatest confidence and for whom he has a very genuine respect. Considering that there are a good many more white people in the South than there are Negroes, it seems to follow logically that in spite of what one hears about the Negro in general, there are a good many individual Negroes who are pretty well thought of by their white neighbors. So we're sort of reflecting on the social sort of the social narrative of how whites view the slaves or the ex-slaves. And he says that, despite the criticisms that, one Negro may be a thief, these particular white people are definitely well aware of a vast majority of other Negroes who are upstanding citizens, and they are people that they can trust. So he's sort of dealing with the social stratification, I guess you could say, of white versus Negro society during a particular time in American history. So he talks a little bit more about some, historical figures. I want to skip ahead here a little bit. I have a really interesting passage. So in chapter 7, he talks about, the title of the chapter is called The Indian and the Negro. And basically what he's doing in this chapter is sort of documenting not only the hardships of African Americans, but also Indian Americans, and how they sort of shared a similar sort of philosophy on what their role was and was to be in American culture. He says here, the Negro was introduced as a laborer in the West Indies in the first instance to take the place of the native Indian, who was the first slave in America. So technically, Native Americans were the original slaves, not necessarily African Americans. But Indian slavery in the West Indies, South America, and in North America did not by any means cease upon the first appearance of Negro slavery. So he's not saying that the second that black slaves arrived, then all of a sudden the Indian slaves were set free. No, they were both kept enslaved. So we have Booker T's scholarship sort of telling us that blacks were not the only slaves. And then if we fast forward to this other section here, if I can find it, he even expounds on white slavery. He says here, the fact of the sufferings of the white slaves taken to Africa is frequently mentioned by the early abolitionists in Massachusetts as a reason for freeing the black slaves in America. One of the earliest books written in this country which obtained any reputation abroad was the story of Algerine captive who described the hardships of these white slaves in Africa. Very interesting, and seeks to turn the sentiment aroused by his foreign white slavery against the black slavery at home. So he's talking about how some of the early abolitionists in particular not only talked about the plight of the American slaves, but they also used foreign slavery of their own white citizens or maybe other European citizens that were suffering the same things over in Africa. He used that as a justification to pursue this idea of emancipation in America. So he was not, a lot of these people, what we sort of learn or what we perceive about slavery is that it was all sort of talking about black American slavery, but there's a whole plethora of different types of slavery that have existed and still exist to this day that Booker T does a really good job of sort of telling us about, which I think is interesting. And like I said in the beginning of the stream, all-encompassing. And that's what the story of the Negro is. It's not just the story of the Negro. The title is kind of misleading, but it's more like the story of everybody kind of focused on the Negro. It says here, as a rule, the Negro was not an anti-slavery agitator. In the South, the free Negroes were frequently themselves slave holders. Okay? Nevertheless, free Negroes were known to be in sympathy with the desire of the slaves to be free. That was the one reason why they were regarded by slaveholders with so much distrust. In the North, free Negroes were very largely engaged in the work of the Underground Railroad. In his history of that institution, so he's talking about black slaveholders, and some of them were sort of sympathetic to maybe the I don't want to say antebellum agenda, but maybe they were more simple. Some of the black slaveholders, if that's a thing, according to Booker T. Washington, it is. They were more compassionate towards the Southern enterprise. During the whole Civil War, and all of that stuff. And of course, we're told that the Civil War was sort of focused on slavery, and that was really only one aspect. I'm not going to get into the other aspects. I'll leave that to the experts. But my annotation here says white slavery in Africa captured by pirates used to justify emancipation of blacks in America. So that's sort of a way that the white societies or the white politicians that were fighting for African American rights in America could sort of justify emancipation, justify freeing the slaves, was to sort of compare it to their own blood and kin that were being enslaved, in Africa or wherever it is. So just really interesting stuff. We're going to skip to about halfway through the book here, where he sort of really delves into the history and the laws of the Negro regiments in the United States Civil War. It says here the Revolutionary, as well as the Revolutionary War too, and Civil War. The Revolutionary War contributed in several ways toward the emancipation of the slaves. Interesting. I was never told that. In the struggle of the colonies to secure liberty for themselves, the sentiments expressed by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence led many white people to feel that Negro slavery was wrong. It was partly this sentiment and partly the needs of the Continental Army that led several of the states to pass laws which provided that slaves might serve in the Patriot Army and that at the end of their service they should go free. So that was another part of emancipation or freeing a lot of the slaves, was they would kind of strike a bargain with some of the slaves, and they said, if you serve in the army for a year or two, help us fight this war against Great Britain, or help us fight this war against the Yankees, then we will grant you emancipation. So it's a little bit contradictory in the sense of what we come to know about slavery, because they don't really tell you that there was a lot of collaboration going on between the blacks and the whites to emancipate the slaves. And of course, it couldn't all happen at once, but maybe if you served in the army or you had a really good relationship with the people that owned you, he gets more into that later, they would push for emancipation. And also, Booker T is sort of mentioning to us that a lot, obviously he doesn't know exactly the exact number, but he says in a number of cases from the research and from the travels that he did, he claims that most of the slaves had fairly decent relationships with their masters. It's a very controversial statement. Maybe that's partly the reason a lot of people don't like Booker T. Washington, because maybe he was sort of sugarcoating slavery in a lot of ways. I don't know. Adreno says, yeah, they don't teach that. They definitely do not. I mean, I think they might if you took a real specific course or something. But, anyway. This is a good discussion. I'm glad you're enjoying it. So he also says here, although Negro soldiers had fought in the Revolutionary War and in the War of 1812, it was some time before the federal government was prepared to enlist Negro soldiers to fight in the Civil War against the people who were still holding black men as slaves. So there was a little bit of resistance, perhaps, to letting African Americans sort of fight in the Civil War, at least initially, because they thought that maybe their interests would be at stake or something. As a matter of fact, it was in the Confederate armies that the first Negro soldiers were enlisted. Fascinating. During the latter part of April 1861, a Negro company at Nashville, Tennessee, made up of free people of color, offered its services to the Confederate government. Shortly after, a recruiting office was opened, for free Negroes at Memphis, Tennessee, as a grand review of the Confederate troops in New Orleans, Louisiana. One of those features of which, there's actually a guy that I follow on Instagram, who sort of is a member of this, sort of like a reenactment sort of museum community. But he was telling me a lot about how what we've been told about the Confederacy, being owned by these greedy, violent slave-holding whites, and yes, maybe that was partly true, but there was also a lot of collaboration going on with blacks in the Confederacy that were either sort of compromising with the Confederate interest, maybe for emancipation or to serve in the army. And I don't legitimately believe, you guys can tell me in the comment section if you think I'm wrong, but I don't think that the Southern black society in general as a whole really wanted to see their entire society crumble and be destroyed by the Yankees. I do believe that most of them wanted to be free, right? But I don't think that they necessarily wanted to go to war. And there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that a lot of these slave-holding Southern whites, as well as blacks, were sort of already, if not slowly, sort of trying to implement emancipation that would prevent a civil war, perhaps. And I'm not saying this is the case for every single Southerner or every single Southern Democrat or whatever, but it's definitely the case for some. So let's see where he goes here. So in about halfway through the book, we've kind of gone past the transatlantic slave trade. We've gone past the Civil War, the Revolutionary War. We've gone past post-Reconstruction, or Reconstruction rather, and now we're sort of in post-Reconstruction. Like we said in this chapter, it's called The Early Days of Freedom. Really interesting chapter. And it goes on to say as follows: the Negro slaves always believed that someday they would be free. From the Bible, the only book the masses of people knew anything about, they learned the story of the children of Israel, of the house of bondage, and of 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and they easily learned to apply this story to their own case. So that's one thing you will find that's very admirable about black Americans, is a lot of them have a real strong faith. I'm not saying they all do, but they have a particular faith, and they have a particular strength about them that is a result of their sort of religious fervor, right? Their religious determination. And they did compare themselves to the Jews in ancient Israel, being, casted out by the Egyptians and being, sort of berated by God and sort of being thrown to the side. They related to the ancient Jews for that particular reason. I think that's really fascinating too. The early black societies, especially if they were educated or went to church, were familiar with scripture, they used their faith as a way to seek, whether it was emancipation or just a way to enrich their endeavors as a whole. So, and that's another thing that Booker T touches upon really nicely here, is the strong religious faith and the collaboration between the churches that took place to emancipate a lot of slaves. And he talks about the slave songs and sort of the black songs that were sung. The plantation upon which my mother lived was in a remote corner of Virginia, where we saw almost nothing of the war, except that some of those who had gone away as soldiers were brought home dead, and it was not until the very close of the war that Union soldiers came through our part of the country and carried off with a few of the slaves from our community. One of the curious things about the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863 was that it probably did not immediately confer freedom on a single slave. Interesting. This was because it was limited in its application to those territories over which the federal armies had no control. In the border states, and whenever the Union armies were established, the institution of slavery remained, nominally at least, as it had been. So that's interesting. On the other hand, the federal armies entered upon slave territories. No matter what theory the government held to, it was found impossible in practice to maintain the slave system. Fort Monroe in Virginia, Washington, District of Columbia, and a large number of other places had been collected into camps, and the problem of dealing with the Negro and freedom was brought in this way for the first time, definitely before the northern people for solution. Let me reread that here. Large numbers of the freedmen had been collected into camps, and the problem of dealing with ex-slaves in freedom was brought in this way for the first time, definitely before the northern people for solution. It's a little bit confusing the way he said that. He said freedmen were to be governed, to be educated, and in general to be started in the new life of freedom, which is now open to them. The difficulties that presented themselves were appalling and immediately aroused the deepest sympathy and concern among the people in the northern states. Okay, so he's saying that there was some refuge in the north for the ex-slaves. So he talks more about emancipation, Reconstruction, and sort of phasing out the old slave laws. Thus, it was the work of what was afterward called Reconstruction, began in the South, whether the Union forces obtained possession of the country. In the Department of General Banks, Louisiana, there were 90,000 colored people. Interesting. So the Freedmen's Bureau, he talks about that. And then... So we have an interesting passage here where he discusses the first blacks in Congress. The announcement that a colored man had been elected to the Senate of the United States created a great deal of surprise and comment, and the appearance of a new senator from Mississippi was to take the place that had been occupied by Jefferson Davis, president of the Southern Confederacy, was waited with great interest. Strenuous efforts were made to resist on the ground that it was unconstitutional and unprecedented the determination of the Senate to allow him to take his seat. Charles Sumner made a speech in favor of the admission of the colored senator in which he said, "The vote on this question will be an historical event marking the triumph of our great cause." So he's talking about how, it was a pretty big deal when they elected the first African Americans to Congress. But this took place, says here, the first move to obtain some part in the government was made by the free Negroes of New Orleans, dating as far back as 1863. The free colored people of New Orleans held a meeting and drew up an address to the Brigadier General, documenting many of the descendants of those men whom the illustrious Jackson styled his fellow citizens. So as far as back as even prior to the Civil War, we see efforts being made even in the Deep South to sort of start to help the slaves, right? So that's why we mentioned earlier, if the Civil War could have maybe been stopped or postponed or compromised, maybe it wouldn't have resulted in so much bloodshed, because it's obvious that the North was already sort of implementing an anti-slavery America, but it's also clear that the South was also doing the same thing. And Booker T. Washington talks about how by a lot of historical standards, a lot of the slaves right up around the time of the Civil War, although they still had quote unquote masters, they were almost living as if they were already free. If they had a decent master, that is, right? So he's saying here, but the fall of the Reconstruction government in the South carried disaster to, let me see here. He was talking about a particular person. I think I might have the wrong sticky note on this part, but this section here, Booker T. Washington actually makes the conclusion that the African Americans and the ex-slaves fared far better than the Native Americans, and he talks about how going back to that strong perseverance of African Americans. Not that the Native Americans didn't have that, but they were not able to sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? They were not able to acclimate themselves in American society quite so successfully as black people were able to do. And they were, Native Americans, they just didn't really have that work ethic. They didn't have really the strength for it. They were more like hunter-gatherers, right? But they didn't really have that real collective sort of mindset to put their mind to something and either work for it or invest for it or collaborate for it. A lot of the Native Americans either wanted to just rebel or they just kind of were, gave in, and they didn't really. It was either like fight or flight or fight or fight or flight or whatever. They didn't really have that collaborative bone in their spirit to the same degree that the Negro did. I think that's really interesting. So moving on to, we're getting a little bit halfway through the book here. I'm trying to look at the timestamp. How long have we been live here? Okay, we've been on for about 40 minutes here. We're going to probably wrap up a story of the Negro here. I'm just going to point out a couple more interesting things. He says here, I want to emphasize just as strongly that the Southern white man who owned slaves have stood by them and helped and protected them in freedom in like manner and some oftentimes to the same degree. It says here, I was surprised to learn that in spite of all that I had heard and in spite of all that I had read about the bitter experiences South Carolina went through during Reconstruction, the relations between individual colored men and the individual white men throughout that state were friendly and helpful to a degree that few people outside of the state of South Carolina had comprehended. I recall that in almost every case, each one of these men attributed a large part of their success to the friendship or to the assistance which they had received from some white man. On the leading men in this party who was as responsible as anyone else for the success of our campaign was Richard Carroll, the founder of an industrial home for Negro orphans, and one of the organizers of an association who held the first successful Negro state fair in South Carolina. So very interesting, and that might have been kind of a rarity, right? But you could, and it's almost like hard to believe, because it's so different from what we've been taught. I think, we grow up in school with, dare I say, a political agenda, but also sort of a sociological agenda that they're not necessarily going to talk about the positive aspects of something. They're going to tell you about the worst possible case scenario, right? And I don't think, I'm definitely not justifying anything bad that took place. I don't think Booker T. Washington is doing that either. But I do believe he's trying to offer us, like I said, an all-encompassing sort of narrative versus just, like the one that we've kind of been discussing, where it's only one side of things. Right? So I wrote up in the margins, mostly positive relations between ex-slaves and former masters. I don't know if it was mostly positive, but we could say maybe, 45, 50% positive. Education existed within the slave class. He says here, Negroes were employed as iron miners and ship carpenters, wheelwrights, coopers, tanners, shoemakers, before the Revolutionary War. As early as 1708, Negro mechanics had become common enough in Pennsylvania to arouse the opposition of free white workmen who at that time petitioned the legislature against the practice of hiring out slaves. So obviously, at some point in time, even though slavery was rampant, it seems to be that there, depending on who you were owned by, what skills you had, whether you were working at a plantation or whether you were more like a farm setting, there was a different hierarchy of slavery kind of, and some of them went on to become, merchants and shoemakers, and they were trained skills. And that's something that I was never aware of. I just kind of assumed that every single black person was, out in the fields picking cotton or something, but that's not really true. A lot of them were skilled craftsmen, and although they may still have been slaves, they were able to learn a lot of, crafts, useful crafts that they were able to use after emancipation to help them succeed, right? Dreamer says, what made you choose this subject for this video? Well, I read these two books about 3 or 4 months ago, and I just haven't got around to really reviewing them. We took a little break from in-depth literature, but I realized after I scheduled the stream that it's Black History Month, so it seems like a really good time to get into this. It says here, in Virginia, Negroes worked in tobacco factories, ran the steamboats, and were employed in numerous kinds of skilled labor. In Charleston and in some other places, Negroes were employed in cotton factories. In Alabama, there was some time before the war, as I have heard, an enterprising white man who converted his plantation to an industrial school for slaves. In other words, he would buy untrained slave boys and give them instruction in the different trades that were used upon the plantations, then sell them again at a much larger price than he paid for them. It was not unusual, in fact, for a well-trained mechanic to sell for as high as $2,000, while an able-bodied field hand would sell for $800 to $1,000. I mention these facts because they show that even in slavery, the value of education was clearly recognized. So it's, we definitely hear that narrative that, slaves were not able to read, they couldn't do this, they couldn't do that, but obviously a good majority of them were educated, at least in a sort of a hands-on practical way, right? They might have not have been educated on the university level, but although some of them were, but they were educated in a way that just sort of by default that their masters could even make more money off of them. So they're kind of being exploited, but at the same time, they're living better lives, even within the hierarchy of slavery, because they're able to, have practical skills. And he says here, he's talking about sort of after slavery ended, right? As a rule, they lived more comfortably. What is he making here? So he's talking about the shoemakers and the mechanics. And he talks about how they were, if the ones that sort of worked at a factory, obviously they lived a better life than the ones on the plantations. After slavery disappeared, the Negro boy and girl no longer had the same opportunity to learn the trades they had in slavery time. At the same time, as the country developed and as new machinery and new methods of doing things were introduced, there was a greater demand for skilled labor than there had been before. Wherever machinery was introduced to perform work which had previously been performed by hand labor, it generally happened that the white man was employed to do that kind of work. It seemed to many persons that the Negro, in losing his monopoly in the trades, was losing also his position in them. So he's talking about the fact that Reconstruction sort of destroyed the entrepreneurial system or the hierarchy that the institution of slavery, in some cases, maybe not all, provided hands-on practical training so that black people could almost work their way up within the confines of a fairly limited system. But after the whole Southern society broke apart, it was much harder for them to sort of find their bearings, kind of is what he's suggesting. And he has a really interesting chapter about whites and blacks going into business together. It says here, it was not an unusual thing in slavery days for a colored man and a white man to go into business together. Negro and white artisans worked side by side during slavery, and the freedom to labor and to engage in business without prejudice has always existed. In all the ordinary forms of business and of labor, there is no prejudice against the Negro. I should rather say that, other things being equal, a Southern white man who has a job of work to do would prefer to have a Negro perform it. So that's partly true, but maybe it's not true. I mean, he's talking about a specific time period, right? So then he starts talking, he does have a whole chapter about crime, violence, lynchings, sort of the socio-political struggles where they were trying to, forbid blacks from getting into the government and so on and so forth. But they also had, and he talks about here, he talks about the what's the word I'm looking for? He talks about the demographics of early African Americans that were in jail, and he sort of broke it down, and it's actually not as high of a number as we're sort of trained to believe. I forgot how he broke it down here, but he sort of said that in comparison to a lot of other races and other places or something. There's not necessarily a huge majority of them in jail, but I'm not sure where he was going with that. And he talks about different reformatory associations that were organized. And then he talks about, towards the end of the book, he talks about laws passed preventing Negro education. So that was a thing. And then he talks about the Negro secret societies. There's a whole slew of them. The Masonic Order, which is the oldest and so far in its history is concerned, the most interesting of these orders, had its origin in the following manner. During the Revolution, he talks about the history of the black, the black Freemasons, and sort of these secret black societies were able to sort of advocate in a more influential manner than just the typical, locals, I guess you could say. Then he talks about Prince Hall, who is the first black Grand Master of the Lodge of the Negro Masons. Really interesting. Then he kind of goes into a retrospective here about the success of blacks in pre-Civil War era, around the early 1800s. And he talks about Negro communities, Negro homes, potential benefits of segregation, such as, this is in Booker T. Washington's opinion, whatever one may be disposed to think of this segregation of the white and black races which one sees going on to a greater or lesser extent in every section of the country, it is certain that there is a temporary advantage to the Negro race in the building up of his own town, or these race towns. And they had these towns that were designated for during Reconstruction, where black people left or they were allowed to go there, and they were self-sustaining prior to the end of segregation. And obviously segregation is terrible, right? But there was an aspect to it where the black Americans sort of owned more of their own stuff. They had their own communities, they had their own economies, they had their own banks. Not so much anymore, because of so that's I think what Booker T. Washington is doing for us is showing us many different ways to look at one problem. Instead of looking at it through one lens, you can kind of see a lot of different avenues to it. He talks about Negroes in the arts, like Negro poets, Negro musicians. There's a chapter about white and black collaborating to end the violent crimes. It says here, there seems to have been a general feeling that colored people were either themselves criminal or so disposed to shield and protect criminals of their own race that their protests against lawlessness and lawbreaking were not to be taken seriously. It became absolutely necessary, therefore, that the committee should secure the support of the influential white people of the city if they hoped to be successful in the campaigns they had planned. And that's not something we really see so much in this, I guess, the woke era. It's almost like us versus them versus us. One group has to have all the power, or one group is the only group that's suffering. But Booker T. Washington kind of reminds us that when one group in America is suffering, when one group is disadvantaged, the whole nation kind of suffers, right? But that doesn't mean that it has to fall into all-out chaos and that we have to start burning our cities down and all that kind of stuff. Then he has an interesting chapter. I made an annotation here about some old Negro historians. I think we're at the end of the book here, and I think Booker T's thesis statement is basically, I seem to have emphasized the success of the Negro rather than his failures, and to have said more about his achievements than about his hardships. It is because I am convinced that these things are more interesting and more important. To me, the history of the Negro people in America seems like the story of a great adventure in which, for my own part, I am glad to have had a share. At the present time, the Negro is, so to speak, engaged in hewing its path through the wilderness. As an individual, I would rather belong to a race that has a great and difficult task to perform than be a part of a race whose pathway is strewn with flowers. It is only by meeting and manually facing hard, stubborn, and difficult problems that races, like individuals, are in the highest degree made strong. So that's just, oh, that's so good. And what happened to this kind of attitude? It's almost non-existent now. But that is the story of the Negro. We went a little longer than I anticipated, but like I said, a lot to get through there. So we're going to move on briefly, probably spend the next half an hour on Harriet Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Really interesting sort of memoir, but in the style of like literature, 18th century literature. And this is definitely not a Booker T. Washington narrative. It's more like the typical sort of book you might read, like Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman or something. But there's actually a very strong, similar to the Booker T. Washington book, there's a very, very strong religious fervor and an almost religious sort of solution to slavery. And Harriet Jacob tells us that slavery is not only bad for the blacks, obviously, but it creates an inherent evil and vileness within the whites that's almost akin to the devil. And Harriet Jackson has this really profound religious faith that helps her get through. And I think when we're talking about religion or slavery or injustice, in the school systems, right, or maybe in modern education, religion is never part of the equation. But I think that professors or programs or sort of certain ideologies forget the importance of the role of religion in struggling communities getting through something. Religion provides a haven. Religion provides guidance for these individuals. So we're going to kind of just break this open and kind of analyze it a little bit. I appreciate you all joining the stream. We got Dreama in here. Everybody else has been pretty quiet, but hopefully you're getting something out of it. And this is book. What's also interesting about Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is that it was confirmed to be real, but there was speculation that maybe it was part of the sort of the emancipation propaganda that was taking place, around the late 1800s, mid 1800s. But it was confirmed as real. It's published as a Penguin classic. It says here, Harriet Jacobs, Linda. That's sort of an acronym for Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Written by herself, 1861, the best-known 19th century African-American woman's autobiography makes a marked contribution to American history in letters by having been written, as Jacob stressed, by herself. And now that means it was written by her. I don't think it necessarily means she literally wrote it in a room by herself. Many other narratives by women who have been enslaved, for example, Sojourner Truth, have been dictated to amanuenses whose roles diluted the authenticity of the text. Jacobs not only wrote her own book, but as an abolitionist and ardent reader, she knew the literary genres of her time. And that's something that I kind of mentioned, is that this is, one part sort of anti-slavery, philosophy, but it's also like literature. She puts herself among the greats, like Charlotte, Jane, Charlotte Bronte or Emily Dickinson or somebody like that, or Jane Austen. She's sort of writing in that style of that a lot of women were famous for writing for during this time. Her self-consciously gendered and thoroughly feminist narrative criticizes slavery for corrupting the morals and the families of all it touched, whether rich or poor, white or black. She lays the groundwork for the analysis of black womanhood. It shows first the myriad traumas owners and their agents inflicted upon slaves, bloody whippings, the R word, consisted ground zero for the enslaved conditions, but in addition, slaves were subject to a whole series of soul-murdering psychological violations, destruction of the families, abandonment of children, harassment, verbal abuse, humiliation, etc. But she especially stresses the assault on slave psyches. Second, she denounces the figure of the happy slave as a slave and later as an abolitionist, she was frequently confronted with this favorite American myth, which she knew to be false. So this is directly sort of in contrast to Booker T. Washington, right? And I think when we're talking about Booker T. Washington, he obviously is coming from a male perspective, maybe a more affluent, upper class black male perspective, which is going to contrast much differently than a poor black female's sort of experience. I'm not saying that they're all 100% different, because I think it's important to find these solutions. It's important to find the commonalities, right, as opposed to just the differences. But a black man's experience is going to be much different than a black woman's, and I think that's what she's kind of telling us in here. So the first, we have the introduction. She talks about the Nat Turner revolt. You never knew what it is to be a slave, to be entirely unprotected by law or customs, to have the laws reduce you to the condition of a chattel, entirely subject to the will of another. And you almost get the sense, or you get the understanding of that people were property, basically. And yes, there was some ounces of humanity depending on who they were owned by, or who they worked for, or where they were able to sort of escape to. But not a lot of wiggle room for early poor blacks. She's mentioned several times in this narrative slaves who have been so brutalized as to lose all human feeling. We still recognize the behavior she described, now labeling it trauma and the effects of post-traumatic stress syndrome, depression, self-loathing, anger, violence against the self or others. So that's pretty much the introduction. This is like the original pressing, like the original layout for the original pressing, which is pretty cool. And she's very well read. She says here, Northerners know nothing at all about slavery. They think it is perpetual bondage only. They have no conception of the depth of degradation involved in that word, slavery. If they had, they would never cease their efforts until so horrible a system was overthrown. She's got a reference from the Old Testament. Rise up, ye women that are at ease. Hear my voice, ye careless daughters. Give ear upon my speech. So she says here, reader, be assured that this narrative is no fiction. I am aware that some of my adventures may seem incredible, but they are nevertheless strictly true. I was born and reared in slavery, and I remained in a slave state 27 years. Since I have been at the North, it has been necessary for me to work diligently for my own support and the education of my children. I have not written my experience in order to attract attention to myself. On the contrary, it would have been more pleasant for me to have been silent about my own history. Neither do I care to excite sympathy for my own sufferings, but I do earnestly desire to arouse the women of the North to a realizing sense of the condition of 2 millions of women at the South, still in bondage, suffering what I have suffered, and most of them far worse. So she's setting up the narrative of that slavery for women is oftentimes much worse because of the sort of sexual degradation that takes place. And she is owned by this man named Dr. Flint, and he was pretty abusive. Then he starts kind of creeping on her, right? She's watched her, some of her friends die during childbirth. If a slave is unwilling to go with his new master, he is whipped or locked up in jail until he consents to go and promises not to run away during the year. If he lives until the next year, perhaps the same man will hire him again without even giving him an opportunity of going to the hiring ground. After those for hire are disposed of, those for sale are called up. So she has a relationship with her brother. And she also has a relationship with her grandmother, I think. And she ends up falling in love with another local black man. But her owner basically forbids this. And he starts, kind of micromanaging her whereabouts and micromanaging her relationship. And you can sort of get the sense how she's not only at a physical, sort of social disadvantage, but even beyond that, her spiritual, romantic desires are stifled by Dr. Flint. She talks about a slave that tried to escape. Says some weeks after his escape, he was captured, tied, and carried back to his master's plantation. Not going to read that because it's quite explicit. So here we get into the religious faith. My annotation says, idea of religious faith versus the evils of satanic slavery. Says, if a slave, let's see here, the master who did these things was highly educated and styled a perfect gentleman. He also boasted the name and standing of a Christian, though Satan never had a true follower. I could tell of more slaveholders as cruel as those I have mentioned. They are not exceptions to the general rule. I do not say there are no humane slaveholders. Such characters do exist, notwithstanding the hardening influence around them, but they are like angel visits, few and far between. So that's much different than the Booker T. Washington sort of narrative, right? That slavery was, sort of this collaborative effort, and, so just a much different narrative at large. She taught her slaves to lead pure lives. She's talking about another lady that she was briefly owned by. She taught her slaves to lead pure lives and wished them to enjoy the fruit of their own industry. Her religion was not a garb put on for Sunday and laid aside till Sunday returned again. The eldest daughter of the slave mother was promised in marriage to a free man, and the day before the wedding, this good mistress emancipated her in order that her marriage might have the sanction of law. So there was some good slave owners even in her experience, but not enough of that, obviously. Y'all, thank you for watching the stream, guys. Really appreciate it. I hope you guys are getting them. So thank you for the 5 likes. I really appreciate you out there. So she's not only talking about the disadvantages of enslaved people socially and economically, but she's saying that slavery infests this satanic, vile, morose sort of stain upon the American society in general, and that it corrupts, because the white slave owners, in most cases men, not always, are taking advantage of the slaves, that they are defiling their own religious sort of, they're defiling not only their own families and their own daughters by proxy, because they're perpetrating misogyny perhaps, in the case of slavery, but they're also committing this, this sexual satanic sin through taking advantage of slaves in the physical realm. We have this idea here as slavery as a disservice to whites. She says here, for he had fed and clothed his slaves better than most masters, and the lash was not heard on his plantation so frequently as on many others. Had it not been for slavery, he would not have been a better man and his wife a happier woman. No pen can give an adequate description of the all-pervading corruption produced by slavery. The slave girl is reared in an atmosphere of licentiousness and fear. The lash and the foul talk of her master and his sons are her teachers. When she is 14 or 15, her owner or his sons or the overseer, or perhaps all of them, begin to bribe her with presents. So you can, and I think women go through that in general, even like, indentured servants or just white Southern women in general, especially during this time in particular, even still to this day. Look to the internet where women are kind of, harassed and stuff like that. So there's something to be said for the unique experience of not only the enslaved woman, but just the woman in general. Sort of being overly pursued by my brother's been doing a lot of topical videos about the simps and how men don't really no boundaries anymore and how they just sort of keep pursuing women. So that kind of applies to this. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she is whipped or starved into submission to their will. She may have had religious principles inoculated by some pious mother to grandmother or some good mistress. She may have a lover whose good opinion and peace of mind are dear to her heart. The slaveholders' sons are, of course, vitiated, even while boys, by the unclean influences everywhere around them. Nor do the master's daughters always escape. Severe retribution sometimes come upon him for the wrongs he does to the daughters of the slaves. The white daughters early on hear their parents quarreling about some female slave. Their curiosity is excited, and they soon learn the cause. They are attended by the young slave girls whom their father has corrupted, and they hear such talk as should never meet youthful ears or any other ears. They know that the woman slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases they exercise the same authority over the men slaves. So they're talking about the corrupt and the terrible family situations that, and you can really get it. You really get a sense of how this, obviously life is bad for the slaves, but it's really bad for the slave owner's family too, because he's corrupting his whole family, right? So around the later period of the 21 years, she starts plotting her escape from the master. Yeah, no problem, Dreamer. We'll see you in the next one. I'm going to try to figure out why my messages haven't been sending to you. They're over on Gmail. Appreciate you coming over tonight. Have a great night. Get some sleep. She says here, and now, reader, I come to a period in my unhappy life which I would gladly forget if I could. The remembrance fills me with sorrow and shame. It pains me to tell you of it, but I have promised to tell you the truth, and I will do it honestly. For years, my master has done this utmost to pollute my mind with foul images and to destroy the pure principles inculcated by my grandmother and the good mistress of my childhood. So she's talking about this, the sexual harassment. She says, but I was struggling alone in the powerful grasp of the demon slavery, and the monster proved too strong. I felt as if I was forsaken by God and man, as if all my efforts must be frustrated, and I became reckless in my despair. So she starts to, not only is she sick of being a slave, but she was not granted access to get married to her lover. So she starts planning her escape. But actually before that, she actually gives birth to a baby boy. And this was, I believe, the child of her lover. So she was able to have a child with this. Somehow she obviously her master is not happy about the fact she's having a child, and he is still actively pursuing her, harassing her. And then there's a chapter here about the local mobs who attack after the Nat Turner insurrection that we talked about briefly, and Booker T. Washington as well. So Harriet Jacobs is sort of starting to see the uprising in the local Southern community against slavery. And that in part sort of inspires her own sort of journey to try to get as far away from Dr. Flint as she possibly can. Not reflecting that the power which trampled on the colored people had also kept themselves in poverty, ignorance, and moral degradation. Nat Turner's insurrection broke out, and the news threw our town into great commotion. Strange that they should be alarmed when their slaves were so contented and happy, but so it was. So a lot of these slave owners and slave companies would try to not only promote this public image of the happy slave, right, but they also tried to sort of indoctrinate their own slaves into this sort of, mindless drone sort of attitude that they were content where they were, and that if they were free, they wouldn't know what to do with themselves, etc. So that's one way that the slave owners sort of manipulated their victims. So then she talks about the importance of church in slavery. She says, After the alarm caused by Nat Turner's insurrection had subsided, the slaveholders came to the conclusion that it would be well to give the slaves enough of religious instruction to keep them from murdering their masters. The Episcopal clergyman offered to hold a separate service on Sundays for their benefit. His colored members were very few and also very respectable, in fact, which I presume had some weight with him. The difficulty was to decide on a suitable place for them to worship. The Methodist and Baptist churches admitted them in the afternoon, but their carpets and cushions were not so costly as those of the Episcopal. So there's also we see here how religion was used to instill fear in the local slaves after the Nat Turner Revolution. Sort of the Southern societies were trying to find a way to sort of pacify the slaves, right, so that they wouldn't rebel. It obviously didn't work. So then Dr. Flint is still pursuing her quite heavily. One of her friends says, "Your skin is darker than mine, but God judges men by their hearts, not by the color of their skin." So I really love how she includes this religious overtone as a solution for slavery. It's really great. So on page 108 or 107, Harriot escapes. She says, "Sally, I have to run away. Let me in quick." She opened the door softly and said in a low tone, "For God's sake, don't. Your grandmother is trying to buy you and the children. Mr. Sands was here last week. He told her that he was going away on business, but he wanted her to go ahead about buying you and the children." So her grandmother is trying to purchase Harriet as well as her kids, that being her grandkids, in order so they don't have to escape into a tumultuous, like being on the run. She wants to sort of adopt them so she can emancipate them. And then Harriet documents more about her experience and her viewpoints of slavery on this page. And then she escapes on a boat and starts heading for New York, I believe. She's heading towards she said, "We had escaped from slavery and we supposed ourselves to be safe from the hunters, but we were alone in the world and we had left dear ties behind us, ties cruelly sundered by the demon slavery." And basically Harriet Jacobs, about halfway through the text here, is basically living in obscure secrecy, and she's sort of she's living under like these bunkers under people's like kitchens and just like laying down like this for like 10 hours at a time. And she talks about how her body is aching and how bad the experience is becoming. But she does have some white and black, both people that sort of conspire to help her throughout her, not only through her journey to migrate to the South or to emigrate from the South, but to sort of try to establish herself. And these people are there to help her. And she talks about her brother Benjamin, and how I think he sort of was attempting to sort of escape or, try to get under the process of emancipation as well. So basically, and her slave owner, Dr. Flint, is basically sort of stalking her, and he's trying to woo her back. And he's sort of, has little, little spies out there to try to figure out where she ends up kind of throwing out red herrings, and she sort of starts writing letters to him, sort of trying to convince him that she is just on the run, still in the South. Meanwhile, she's already in the free territory in the North. She says here, being in servitude to the Anglo-Saxon race, I was not put into a Jim Crow car on our way to Rockaway. Neither was I invited to ride through the streets on the top of trunks in a truck. But everywhere I found the same manifestations of that cruel prejudice which so discourages the feelings and represses the energies of the colored people. I'm just going to finish underlining that because that's a really good quote there. That's why it's important to make notations while you're reading, because if you ever want to discuss, your books on the spot, you've got something to sort of, get those thoughts going in your head. Towards the end of the book, I didn't annotate quite as much because the narrative was just kind of on the upside. She says here, I do not deny that the poor are oppressed in Europe. I am not disposed to paint their condition so rose-colored either. My visit to England, she also was able to travel to England. My visit to England is a memorable event in my life from the fact of my having there received strong religious impressions, the contemptuous manner in which the communion had been administered to colored people in my native place, the church membership of Dr. Flint and others like him, and the buying and selling of slaves. By professed ministers of the gospel had given me a prejudice against the Episcopal Church. So the Episcopal Church was sort of acting as a sort of a liaison to sort of, quote, help pacify the slaves, but they were sort of plotting. They were sort of trying to suffocate their efforts to revolt or to rebel or to emancipate. So that's interesting. I think that's where the Baptist churches come in, or maybe the different, offshoots of Christianity come in for the black community, because they had to start their own sort of, religious communities that were not going to be, corrupted by the agenda of the slave-holding class, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Are you still into big girls? Will Lennon says, yes. As you can see from the background, definitely have not stopped our love of of big women. So she actually came to Norfolk, Virginia. Really cool. That's pretty interesting. I could not possibly regard myself as a piece of property. Moreover, I had worked many years without wages, and during that time had been obliged to depend on my grandmother for many comforts in food and clothing. My children certainly belonged to me, but though Dr. Flint had incurred no expense for their support, we had received a large sum of money for them. So the fugitive slave law had not been passed. The judges of Massachusetts had not then stooped under chains to enter her courts of justice. So by this point, she's sort of able to sort of start rebuilding her life, right? And then they moved to Boston, I think, and they're fighting the fugitive slave law. And then Dr. Flint dies, so that's like a big, sort of load off her shoulders, right? She doesn't have to worry about her ex-master stalking her anymore. The man was odious to me while he lived, and his memory is odious now. And then the remainder of this narrative basically states, sort of goes into these monologues about how not only she had to struggle, but how she was alienated and isolated from her daughter and from her brother and from her beloved grandmother. But you can definitely get the sense of, it's kind of an interesting emancipation or anti-slavery narrative, because it's a little more focused on religious retribution and the family versus more like the socio-political, legal collaborations or accomplishments, and maybe it's a little less focused on the Underground Railroad. It's more focused on one woman's attempt to not only emancipate and free herself, but also to bring her entire family along with her. And she goes into these really interesting, dialogues of the satanic evils of slavery and how they corrupt both white and black societies. So that's just a quick little recap of these two great books by two black authors that we read this year. Maybe next year for Black History Month we'll take something else on, read something a little more modern. Maybe we could do a James Baldwin or something. So in the next couple of days or weeks, you guys can expect some reading updates. And once I'll talk a little bit about that now. Looks like we still got one viewer. So we are reading As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. Really compelling Southern Gothic sort of novel. We're also getting towards the tail end of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Going to be doing a really long analysis of this because the book is really long. We're also conquering the Iliad by Homer. Really enjoying this. You almost get this sense of man versus God and mortal versus immortality that exists in Iliad's Homer. We're also reading this memoir of a drug addict, a struggling drug addict, which is really interesting, called Tweak. And we're also getting through the short stories of Thomas Wolfe. So with that said, we're going to end this stream. I really appreciate you guys hanging out tonight. Hope you guys got something out of it. Hope it encourages you to read some African American literature or historical text. There's sort of a preconceived notion that we can't relate to black literature or black people can't relate to white literature. But the more we understand each other culturally and spiritually and intellectually, the more we understand ourselves as Americans. So I think that's a really good place to stop. Thank you so much for joining, y'all. And we'll see y'all in the